Welcome back to D&D Module Monday, the show in which I read a module and then talk about it for however long I see fit. Continuing with my foray into all things weird and wacky. Today is I'm pretty excited to talk about this because it hits on some interesting things. But today we are talking about Dragon Dice. Now, if you don't know what Dragon Dice is, it was a collectible dice game that was released and published by TSR back in the 90s. Now, it's very interesting. When TSR first split with Gary Gygax, I think something that doesn't get talked about a lot about TSR is that when they first split with Gygax, they actually did do a pretty good job under the leadership of a woman by the name of Lorraine Williams. Do a pretty decent job of getting back on their feet in the mid-80s and into the 90s. Because when Gygax was running the company, it was just kind of a mess, and Gygax was out in California at one point, and things were not working. The vibes were not vibing, to put it mildly. And so Lorraine Williams steps in, and they do a pretty decent job of getting back on track, namely when, by the end of the 80s, really, they released 2nd edition AD&D and the handbooks for all that, and you know, all the stuff that was associated with that. But as the 90s sort of wore on, they really made a push into different types of tabletop gaming. I'm not going to list all of them, but if you go over to TSR's Wikipedia page, TSR released a ton of board games and other tabletop war games stuff. Stuff like the Buck Rogers series, obviously Chainmail, that was back in the 70s, but Chainmail, for those of you that know, preceded D&D, really. So TSR always kind of had a foothold on tabletop and board gaming. And the reality is, they never really found the same purchase, obviously, that Dungeons & Dragons did. Dragon Dice is still around. It is actually now managed by a company called SFR. But do you know anyone playing Dragon Dice? Because I sure as hell don't. And I don't mean that as an insult to the people that do play it. I'm sure they do play it. I'm sure they're very good at it. Great for them. I can't even really tell you how to play this game because I read the directions for how to do so 3 separate times and I couldn't figure it out. I know that to win you have to capture 2 sets of land, and it's playable by 3 players. You move armies around, and you can attack said armies. You can hold armies in reserve. You can cast spells, and that's pretty much all I was able to figure out about it. Now this box here is the base game. It comes with, these are some cards for each of your players. As I said, 3 players can play at a time, so you have a card for each player. This is the rule book, which, God, it was brutal reading this. Look at how small it is. God, I'm an old man, I understand that, but man, oh man, reading this was brutal on the eyes. It also has a reference sheet, which actually shows you, as it's see here, the table layout and things like the spell list that you could cast, what dragons and certain other aspects of the game might look like. You can also see what different dice units look like. And I'll show you the dice in a moment. My dice are actually still sealed. It also came with this ridiculously cool dice bag. I dig this. The original TSR logo, full stop, was ballin'. It looked phenomenal. The dragon as the S? Yes, please. But this was meant to be a collectible dice game, and when you received these dice, you actually received random assortments. And now these dice, based on their color, in the base game there were 4 different races you could play as. You could play as coral elves, I would just say elves, dwarves, goblins, and... let me make sure I get the last one right, because if I remember correctly, it's a little odd. Elves, dwarves, goblin, and then lava elves. Right. And so the blue one are the coral elves, the green ones are the goblins, the red ones are these are death ones, I think. Because then there's also, like, death units. Remember when I said I don't totally understand this? I really tried. So the black... okay, so wait. The black and red ones, which is this one, that's the lava elves. The blue ones are the coral elves. The goblin ones are gold and black. I don't know. I don't know, dude. I've tried. Like I said, I literally read it like 3 times. So those are... okay, yeah. Yeah. So the blue ones are the coral elves. The red ones are the lava elves. The green ones, that's definitely a goblin. And these red ones are the dwarves, I would presume. Yeah, that's a dwarf picture. Okay. So that solves that. But these were meant to be a collectible dice game in the way that you would think of something like Magic the Gathering being a collectible card game. And the funny thing is, as I circle back to what my sort of original thought was, and I'll give you a look at the kicker packs as well, as they were called, which were just expansions and basically new decks, because these include new races you can play as. These games never achieved the status of Dungeons and Dragons, despite the fact that Dragon Dice was actually pretty well received when it first came out in the 90s. It even there was a Dragon Dice game. You could play Dragon Dice on your computer. And that kind of begged the question to me. It got me thinking, well, why? Why have a lot of these board games, like I said, there were even board games based around like D&D settings, like there was a Dragonlance board game, and they just never found the purchase that Dungeons & Dragons did. And like I said, I found myself asking why. And I think the reality is, and you might disagree with this, I would be fully okay with people disagreeing with this, but this is just my feeling. I think the problem when you take a look at this Dragon Dice, or any sort of these board games, because the majority of the TSR board games were based around fantasy settings. They had some that were based in more like sci-fi or realistic settings, but for the most part, they were fantasy settings. This game, Dragon Dice itself, features several monsters that are basically from Dungeons & Dragons, just by slightly different names. And this is the dice for this pack. This pack adds Amazon units, which are these yellow, kind of cream-colored dice. But the reason I think these games never really took hold, so to speak, is because when you really look at them, they wind up just feeling Dungeons & Dragons adjacent, and not necessarily in a good way. So when you think about successful card games, the most successful one is Magic the Gathering, and obviously the success of Magic the Gathering and the fact that TSR in the 90s was really trying to get into the card game and dice game space was a big part of why TSR eventually went out of business. These games just kind of feel, again, like Magic the Gathering was its own thing. It had its own world, its own systems, its own purpose. Dragon Dice, in comparison, and a lot of the fantasy board games that TSR came up with, kind of just feel like D&D without the D&D. And when you have that, as good as the systems might be, eventually people are just going to say, well, I just want to play D&D. not only do I just want to play D&D, but if I want to play a card game, I'll just play Magic. I don't think personally, by the way these games were marketed and set up, I don't think they were personally ever constructed to have much of a chance to stand on their own. Because when you so closely, again, make them D&D adjacent, as I called it, you're then... It's like competing with an arm tied behind your back. When you have something like Magic that is so thoroughly its own thing, and you're not so thoroughly your own thing, even as these, I mean, all of these kicker packs in the base game include lore and stories, it just winds up feeling kind of cheap. And I'm not surprised that a lot of these like 90s board games and card games from TSR didn't sell well because they didn't stand out well enough on their own. And I think that's a really interesting thing, because now you have Dragon Dice. I have these games here in front of me, and what purpose do they serve? Did they serve? I don't know if they served much purpose when they were originally being printed. You know, one of the biggest problems that people sort of had with Dragon Dice was that you had to just keep buying Dragon Dice. So you have to form armies out of the dice you have, right? And this one, the second kicker pack, introduces the Firewalkers. Now, I got literally all Firewalker dice in this pack. Now, that might have been intentional. I don't think it was. But I did get literally all Firewalker dice. So I could now take these dice and make a Firewalker army, right? I would say I have enough dice here, based on from what I understand, because you have to use 3 different races at least to build out your board at the start of a game. I could easily use the Firewalker for one of my armies because I have enough dice here to do it. Right? So if I go back to the base game here, if we take a look at the dice that I received in the base game again, I could very easily make an army of Coral Elves, but I don't have much else going on. I don't really have enough dice for... I don't really have enough dice for Goblins, Dwarves, or the Lava Elves. So I would have to go buy more Dragon Dice, which was something that people were kind of like, you know, I kind of want to be able to play the game properly out the box, which is a very fair criticism, by the way. And I think at the end of the day, too, I think part of the problem with these dice, they claim in the reference guide and that they're separated in rarity by size, that the bigger dice are rarer, and that the certain character images that are on the dice, like if you see there's a picture of a Coral Elf, that they're selected, that there's, I can show you, there's different levels of rarity, which is supposed to like entice you to, hang on, which is supposed to like entice you to go buy more Dragon Dice. But you're dealing with, right, like I can show you here, the reference folder. So you see here, if we look at the Coral Elves or the Dwarves, it has rare, uncommon, and common units that you then get on your dice. And obviously, as you want to get the rare units, you go and buy the dice. But the problem is, like, it just... I think another problem is that these dice just don't stand out. Like, when you buy a Magic card or a card game for a Pokemon card or anything, if you get a real rare card, I mean, you could sell it for buckets, but you could also, like, frame it. Are you going to frame a dice? Like, you get what I mean? Like, it just... I feel like a lot of these games were just made for the purpose of being made. And I think the fact that they were so, again, D&D but not D&D kind of hurt them when they were going up against a giant like Magic the Gathering. And it's not a surprise that TSR really had trouble moving this stuff. Which, again, like I said, ultimately led to the downfall of the company and the sale of the company to Wizards of the Coast, who literally run Magic the Gathering. And still do to this day. And I think it's just sad, because I'm sure this is a fun game. I maybe don't understand it, but I'm sure it's fun. But I also think it goes to show you that when you're not setting things up for success by like maybe if they had just made this Dungeons and Dragons a Dungeons and Dragons dice game, maybe it would have worked. I don't know if it would have, but I think doing this half measure, creating a few pages of lore, new races and whatever, but also using a lot of monsters from D&D, I just don't think it works. I wish it did, because I mean, who doesn't like having more tabletop games to play? But I think it kind of shows an interesting viewpoint in where TSR went wrong in the 90s, because it's like this stuff was just not very well thought out, and it was in a market that it was never going to win with the way it was being presented. And I think that's ultimately a shame, because TSR, like I said, I have a lot of nostalgia for TSR. I still get upset sometimes that TSR went out of business. It just... But when you see stuff like this, is it a surprise? I don't think so. And I think that stinks for Lester Smith, who did a lot of the work on all these Dragon Dice things. I just don't think... I just don't... To me, these kind of look like the offerings of a company that was kind of just trying to do whatever was popular at the time and hang on, and ultimately failing. And that stinks, because I think it undercuts the merits of what I'm sure is a fun game. It's just a shame. I feel kind of lucky to have them. I think it's very neat to have. I do. I asked my father bought these, and I asked him, I said, what the hell were you doing buying Dragon Dice? And he said, I was in a department store, and they were on clearance. And it looked interesting, and I'm sure to him it looked like Dungeons and Dragons. But that's the only reason he bought it. So that goes to show you they were having such trouble moving it that whatever department store bought it from TSR was trying to get it off their shelves as quickly as they could. But yeah, that was just a quick look at Dragon Dice. If you play Dragon Dice, please sound off in the comments. Like, please. I would love... Like I said, I read the directions like 3 times, and I felt real dumb after reading them. I think it's cool. The artwork on these boxes is fantastic, but I just ultimately don't think the premise worked all that well, unfortunately. Or at least it didn't work well enough to make any headway in the tabletop gaming space. Which stinks, because we don't really see, like, people... I think it could have worked today, because people... Think about how people collect dice today. God, do people collect dice today. But at the time, I don't think people were really collecting dice, so to speak. It was more cards. And I just ultimately think Dragon Dice maybe was doomed to fail from the start. Which stinks, but it's neat to look back on. It's an interesting piece of history. That is where I'm going to end this episode. This was fun. I don't think I'll ever play Dragon Dice, but they're cool to have. And there were more kicker packs released, both by TSR and SFR, who now runs it. Yeah, that's Dragon Dice, I guess. Forgotten, sort of, for the most part, unfortunately. But what are you going to do? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.